We want to thank you for joining us, and we would like to begin by acknowledging the lands that we're situated on and honoring the peoples who have allowed us to live and work here.
Hi, this is Katina. Myself and Carol are in the Toronto region, so I will read the land acknowledgement for Toronto. I wish to acknowledge this land in which Ontario lays. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. And I would also like to connect this land acknowledgement to our webinar and the thoughts that we have today in thinking of the student populations and student groups that we serve in public education. I'll turn it over to you, Pam.
And the University of Regina, where I'm located, is situated on Treaty 4 lands with a presence in Treaty 6. These are the territories of the Niha, Anishinaabeg, Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota, and also the homeland of the Métis and Michif Nation. And today, these lands continue to be shared territory of many diverse people from near and far. And again, very much aware of the positionality that we hold within this land and our responsibilities to treaty. And so with that, we are moving through the slides here. And we'll introduce ourselves to you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule. I'm Dr. Katina Pollock, and I'm Associate Professor in the Faculty of Education in Education Administration and Leadership.
And I'm Dr. Pamela Osmond Johnson, and I'm also an Associate Professor of Ed Leadership, and I'm at the University of Regina.
And welcome everyone. My name is Carol Campbell. I'm an Associate Professor at OISE, the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education, University of Toronto. And I want to just briefly mention two other roles that are relevant to our conversation today. I'm a member of the International Council for Education Advisors to the Government in Scotland. And as part of that work, we've been looking at international evidence concerning COVID. And I'm also a director of ICSE, the International Congress for School Effectiveness and Improvement, where we've just launched a research policy and practice network focused on education in times of crisis, including COVID. So lots of research to discuss today.
And we also want to extend a thank you to the EdCan network, who have allowed us to share our work that we've done in this area and are the hosts of the webinar today. So thank you very much to EdCan. And so just quickly, in terms of our agenda today, we're going to be going back and forth between the three of us. In the article, we focus kind of on three primary areas: thoughts for governments, thoughts for teacher organizations, and thoughts for school-based leaders. We're also going to spend some time talking about our thoughts now, given that it's been a little over a month since the article's been out. And as we'll discuss in the webinar, there's lots and lots of things that have happened, both in the education sector and broader societal issues that certainly have impacted our thinking now. And then we're going to be going to some questions and answers from you folks. So we're looking forward to that piece. So in terms of the purpose, our article, really, we identified a particular question within the article, and we want to try to keep coming back to that question. It really encompasses and covers kind of the whole of what our thinking is around this issue, and that purpose is: what conditions need to be in place for students to learn, for teachers to teach, and how will leaders across the system adapt to support these conditions? And so that's kind of, again, where our focus is today across these three areas of governments, teacher organizations, and school-based leaders. So I'm going to hand it over to Carol first to get into some of the thoughts for governments.
Thanks, Pam. So as look, many of you have probably read the article, and thank you for joining us today. So we're going to quickly recap and then talk about the current knowledge and situation. At the height of the global pandemic, over 90% of students around the world were affected by countrywide closures of schools. And that's huge. Now, Canada wasn't actually included in that number because we did not have a national school closure. What happened, as you know, is that provinces and territories made different decisions based on some schools staying open for specific student groups to full school closure. So within the article, we focused on two big ideas. One is, of course, in the context of school closure or limited numbers of students in school, if, when, and how to reopen schools or to expand the number of students in schools safely. And of course, one of the key things we're learning from COVID is the absolute vital importance of being up to date on health information and public health and following those protocols. At the same time, what we know is that our schools are simply not configured for a 2-meter square physical distancing protocol, or necessarily for access to sanitizer, hand washing regularly. So assuming those protocols continue, and all the evidence is that they will, we're likely looking at a scenario when there are going to actually have to be fewer students in classrooms and fewer people in schools. So as we look at the evidence internationally, and now when we begin to see the process emerging in different provinces and territories, we're not returning to the previous schooling. It's not simply reopening schools. It's likely to be phased reopenings, particular student groups, decisions about that, perhaps rotating enrollments, different student groups on different days, or even within a school day, but deep cleaning is required every time there's a change in the population within the school. So there are serious physical health and medical health issues around school reopening. There are also mental and social and emotional health. So obviously COVID is a disease, but there's also the implications that we are seeing mental health and trauma affecting children and young people and adults from this prolonged period of social and physical distancing and staying at home. So we have to plan for how that work will be supported for students and for the professionals. Simply, students can't learn when they're experiencing trauma or grief or anxiety. Which comes to the second big policy decision, how to ensure quality teaching and learning for all students and address inequities for students whether learning in school, remotely, or blended learning combinations. So in no normal educational change strategy would you say, we're going to take over 90% of students and not have them in school, and we're going to have 63 million teachers around the world teaching, but not in school. So I want to recognise that what's happened within and across Canada, where the education profession, in partnership, of course, with parents and guardians and students, has been phenomenal. And we have to now think about how we learn from the past 3 months or so. So I've already said we're not returning to regular schooling. There are issues concerning the status quo, but we also can't continue with an emergency response situation. That's why the current planning is so important for the upcoming school year. So we know in school, there's lots of evidence that the biggest factor that affects students and their learning is teachers and the quality of teaching. We also now have a considerable body of evidence about remote learning in its various forms. And the biggest factor that affects students and their learning is teachers and the quality of teaching, not specifically the mode of teaching or the technology of teaching or some of the current debates that we're having about synchronous and asynchronous, although there are evidence within those pieces. So let's evaluate what we're learning. Let's think about what needs to change, what needs to continue, what needs to be adapted. In the article, we highlighted two pieces, one about the effective integration of technology as part of a repertoire of teaching and learning, two, about the fact that standardized testing has been put on hold all over the world, and how we now ensure that there's resources and supports for diagnostic assessment, feedback, new ways of communicating with students and parents in school and at home. So there's lots of other areas that we will come to, but we need to think about that. And the final comment is that governments moved quickly and quite rightly to protect lives on the basis of health advice, and that must continue. But for this next phase, where we're talking about teaching and learning, the professionals, educators, childcare, early years, as well as the voices of students and families and communities, must be part of co-developing the plan on the way forward. And with that, I'll hand over to Pam, who's going to talk about teacher organisations.
Great, thank you, Carol. And so I'm going to go through some of the points that I kind of highlighted in the article. The first is around ongoing access to professional development. And so much of the work that Carol and I have done in the area of professional development has consistently found two things. One is that PD is an essential element in teaching and learning. One is that PD is an essential element in teaching as the learning profession, and two, that equitable access to professional development or professional learning is often elusive, with professional learning budgets often being the first things that are cut when school divisions might be looking to save money. As reopen plans are being made, there's also a danger that PD days may be cut in an effort to regain some of the lost instructional time. And so, that being said, within the context of the learning loss that Carol had mentioned, it is arguable that teachers may need access to professional learning now more than ever before. And so some of the questions are around how teacher organizations will continue to advocate for and provide access to teacher learning without being perceived as putting the needs of teachers above the needs of students, as is a common thought that happens, particularly emphasized within the media sometimes. Also questions around what new partnerships and programs might be necessary to support the learning of teachers, and what areas of professional learning might be needed the most. And so these are all really important considerations that teacher federations are going to have to be thinking about around ensuring access to ongoing professional learning as we think about returning to schooling in the fall and also going forward. In terms of teacher safety and well-being and ensuring safe working conditions are being prioritized, we know that much of the epidemiology around COVID-19 centers around proximity and how easily the virus is being passed in crowded indoor spaces. And so, as Carol again, mentioned earlier, class size issues were certainly present in many jurisdictions prior to COVID-19. And so I'm located in Saskatchewan, and in Saskatchewan, class size and composition was definitely a key bargaining issue for the Saskatchewan Teachers Federation throughout the past year. Undoubtedly, teachers are still concerned about this issue, and the health and safety aspects of COVID-19 certainly brings a whole new lens through which to view the issue of class size and composition. And similar concerns are being raised across the country by teachers in different jurisdictions. Questions around how many students can safely fit in a classroom, what happens for teachers who might be immunocompromised or who are living with someone who is high risk if schools are going to be reopening in the fall. Many provinces do have school reopening planning committees, most of which have representation from the teacher organizations. And so obviously this is going to be another important piece of their work going forward. On the well-being front, like many other professions who are working from home right now, many teachers are balancing their own teaching while simultaneously supporting their children in their learning. The Alberta Teachers Association recently released a really comprehensive survey where they plan to gather information on the experiences of teachers during the pandemic. And they did release a preliminary report last week, and it shows that many teachers are currently struggling with work-life balance. They're feeling isolated and emotionally disconnected from their students, are exhausted at the end of the day, and some are beginning to show signs of compassion fatigue. The Canadian Teacher Federation has adopted this survey, and it's currently open to all educators across the country. And they're currently collecting that data right now. So data from this survey will be crucial for teacher organizations as they attempt to assess the well-being of their members and ensure that their voices are heard in the plans around reopening. As news of possible hybrid models and talk of parents choosing to send their students to school in the fall, teachers are also beginning to voice concerns over increased workloads and being possibly tasked with 2 jobs. Teaching students in school and also developing learning for home plans. Some teacher federations are already beginning to ask questions about what sorts of resourcing is going to be provided to support these hybrid models. Lastly, the issue of member engagement and advocacy work. Just as teachers are feeling distance from their students without the daily interaction, with local meetings, professional development conferences, and provincial committees no longer meeting face-to-face, it also stands to warrant that many may also begin to feel distance from their federations. Given all the issues around workload, stress, and safety, however, it is critical that teacher federations have the strong support of their collective membership right now. But we all know that engagement in the organizations, it doesn't just happen automatically. The organizations have to know their membership, to know their needs, their values, and organize around those needs and values in order to maintain relevancy in the lives of their members. So connecting, obviously, with membership during the pandemic is important, but it can also be really challenging. A webinar with 500 attendees can be useful in many ways, but for many, this will not have the same kinds of connections around loyalty to their organizations as face-to-face conversations might. So questions around what new forms of member communication and public advocacy might be necessary, and also whether or not that's going to require budget shifts as the communications and marketing departments within teacher federations are going to be critical in developing key messaging to really gain support of the public and to rally the membership. Qualitative responses in that ATA survey, for instance, included questions from the members around how the association will work to represent the voices of teachers and keep them and their students safe as school reopen plans evolve. So broadly speaking, obviously, none of these are new issues for teacher federations. Indeed, many of these actually speak to the historical context that really underpin the very origins of organizations of teachers, some of which have been around for over 100 years in some jurisdictions. And yet the pandemic brings a nuanced context, the likes of which we have not seen in the history of modern education in Canada. So how teacher federations navigate these new questions around age-old issues will be crucial to not only the nature of reopening and the future of schooling, but also to their own sustainability as their members grapple with teaching in the COVID-19 era. And so with that, I will pass on to Katina to summarize some of her thoughts about school-based leaders.
Thank you, Pam. As I'm listening to Carol and Pam speak, I'm thinking, if you are a school leader listening to this, you're thinking about how all of this will be actualized and how it will be implemented and delivered in the school systems as we move forward, can be quite daunting. I'd like to start with the second point on the slide. The COVID-19 pandemic has altered the nature of school principals' work or school leaders' work, principals, vice principals. Today's principals are expected to be exceptional managers and extraordinary leaders in a time where the pace of change has increased exponentially. For this panel, I speak to the article where I concentrate on safe schools and leading instruction. At the time of writing this article, these were the predominant focuses for many leaders in the field. The reporting here and what I'm sharing with you comes from some preliminary focus groups that I've done with my colleague Fei Wong over the last 6 weeks. To be clear, school principals' duties in delivering schooling has always included, to a variety of degrees, responsibilities to student health, well-being, and safety. So fulfilling these expectations has heightened during the COVID-19 pandemic. Principals, along with other educators, are now part of the public health effort to prevent disease spread, and they do so within very different local contexts. As you heard from Carol, asking questions about the size of schools, how will we distance, how will the work unfold. Principals and all other educators are what I now call the other first responders, or more appropriately, education first responders. And as Pam mentioned, and Carol mentioned, teachers have a direct impact on student learning. Principals in schools have an indirect impact on student learning. In this situation, their impact, I would say, is even more profound because they are setting the conditions for children to learn and for teachers to teach. Principals need to develop a comprehensive understanding of the coronavirus, including causes, symptoms, public health protocols, and preventions. They do this in a world filled with fake news, inaccurate reporting, and gaps in information sharing and understanding. They must first find up-to-date, accurate information, as new information about the disease is discovered at an unprecedented speed. There will be logistical questions about schooling, many of which have been asked over the past month and will continue to be asked as we as institutions and researchers try to figure out different models and methods to deliver public education. Key questions for school leaders around safety will center on prevention, intervention, health, and well-being of students, staff, and oneself. For example, what kinds of new community school partnerships are needed to support the emotional health and well-being of students and staff? Will the utilization of paraprofessionals become more integral part of public education as we move forward in this pandemic? Thinking about leading instruction, in addition to creating safe conditions for students to learn and for teachers to teach, principals will simultaneously be responsible for leading instruction. How will this unfold? Will be closely tied to the uses of information communication technology to both support various forms of delivery, online, blended, face-to-face, and also running schools virtually in blended situations, but not just whether it's a virtual school or not a virtual school or a blended model. It will be that we may be fluctuating between these models and the ability to pivot, meeting whatever structure is in play at the time. New situations will require new knowledge and skills, and these new skills and knowledge will be acquired simultaneously while continuing to support and deliver school. Questions asked in our article, such as how will principals support teachers in developing and implementing trauma-informed curriculum, practices, and policies? To the first point in the slide, what will effective leadership look like? Will it solely be based on narrowly defined student achievement or attendance data and the like? Or will we understand effectiveness to be more inclusive to other purposes of schooling? How will student wellness play into our notions of effective leadership? How will practices of inclusive and socially just leadership be accounted for? And how will we consider effective leadership for equitable education? These are the things that I hope we will think about for school leaders now and moving forward. I'll turn it over to you, Carol.
Thanks, Katina. Thanks, Pam. So it's been over a month. I have an echo. So our article was published on May the 6th. And it's been over a month since we published that article. And of course, that feels like a lifetime in what is a very rapidly changing situation. So COVID is a novel virus. It's an obvious statement. But what we're learning is that the health evidence is evolving, sometimes changing, and sometimes not yet conclusive. And that's why it's so important that we follow the advice, the public health advice. At the start of COVID, there were some suggestions that children did not get COVID. But now we have children and young people who have tested positive. Unfortunately, there have been deaths among school-age populations. And where schools have reopened, unfortunately, there have been outbreaks and clusters and spread involving both the students and the adults. At the same time, the paediatric advice is also evolving, and there is some concern that while the physical health risks absolutely must be protected, there are also concerns about the fact that children and young people need to play, want to socialise, and are experiencing the social, emotional and mental downside of not being in school or having their regular routine. But then, as both Pam and Katina have said, it's not just children in school, it's also adults, and we have to think about the safety of the staff. So what we know about COVID has changed even in the past month, and what we know about the educational implications are also changing. At the same time, in the past month, we are now witnessing social movements, Black Lives Matters, anti-racist protests, anti-Black racism concerns simultaneously in every state in the USA, here in Canada, and internationally. Now, Canada has a long-standing history of structural inequalities and of systemic racism. This is not new, but this combination of a global health pandemic and social movements advocating for political, economic and social change coming together is unique. And our hope, of course, would be that education and schools can be part of the solution, and indeed should be. So we now are thinking about 3 trends, and we look forward to discussing these. We're seeing bringing to the fore long-standing issues of intersectional inequities that require addressing in and through education. I've mentioned anti-Black racism, Black Lives Matter. A year ago, it's also a year since the release of the Murdered, Missing and Indigenous Women and Girls inquiry that clearly found about genocide involved towards Indigenous people here in Canada. And that amplifies the findings of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Of course, we're also thinking about the teaching and learning implications of this, and we know that we have concerns about students who are English language learners, students who have special needs. So we need to urgently think about these issues, and unfortunately they've not yet been fully addressed by governments and in our education systems. So as we think, and our thinking evolves every day, every morning I read to see what new information, it's overwhelming, but we are looking at the possibility of changes to the status quo of schooling. Canada has many strengths in its education system. Those of you who know my work and our collective work, we of course talk about the high quality education profession that we have here in Canada. We're recognised internationally for our education system, but there always has been more to do, and there is more to do now. And of course, our education profession will be a strength, as we've said, in navigating the way through this. So I can see from the chat box there are already questions about the what next. What we need urgently is more evidence about what the current status of learning is for our students at this current time. So teachers are still teaching, students are still learning, there's still formal education being provided, sometimes in school, mostly remotely, sometimes through hard copy resource packs, sometimes through aspirations for fully online learning. We haven't had this combination before. And as the evidence emerges, we can anticipate that this will have impacted students differently. So Pam already mentioned the ATA, the Alberta Teachers Association survey that has recently been released. And in the ATA survey, school leaders and teachers reported on what they thought had been the impact, concerns about students' handling for online learning. And who were the student groups that the educators had the most concerns about? And the responses were that for 77% of students living in poverty, there were concerns about negative or very negative experiences. For English as second language learners, there were concerns for 68% of that population experiencing very negative or negative experiences. First Nation, Métis and Inuit students, 49% of students were reported as having very negative or negative experiences. And for visible minority students, 36% were reported as having very negative or negative experiences. And we see this pattern emerging in other countries too, where disadvantaged, racialized, underserved students look like being those students that have been the most affected by COVID. And so we're seeing inequities being exacerbated. At the same time, I want to caution some of taking international evidence, even though that's part of my work. So the questions about the learning loss, we need more evidence on this. There's a body of learning loss literature, which is mainly about summer break. And there's important learning from that about the types of strategies and interventions and resources that are needed to support students' learning. At the same time, this isn't summer break. So many schools are closed, but formal education is continuing. They're still teaching. Students are still expected to complete academic work. So we need to see what that particular combination is doing. What we do know is that for the next school year, that process of teachers engaging in review, feedback, diagnostic assessments to see where their students are will be absolutely crucial, as it always is, but even more so at the moment. And we need to think about how that moves forward. And so while we think about that in the context of a return to school, as we've said before, it's also likely that remote learning and blended learning will be continuing in some forms. So it's time for a serious investment in education. COVID-19 comes on top of austerity and cuts in many parts of Canada. We know there's going to be an economic impact, and we know that that may affect education, likely will. But we also know that there are likely inequities and there needs to be support, additional support for those students who are struggling. We also know that we need high quality teaching and learning environments in school and at home. So in school, the physical safety and health and hygiene will require new ways of configuring school. And then for remote and online learning, universal access to high speed, high quality internet has become an educationally important right as well as a human right. And we also know from the literature on online learning that the most effective approach is one person to one device. So we have to think about how we make sure that each and every student has access to the resources they need, but also each and every educator to support that learning. And finally, as we've touched on in other comments, if we're seriously thinking about some students in school, some students at home, some students in blended learning and various combinations, that's too much to ask to be laid on top of existing workload and work intensification. So we're going to have to need an investment in staffing. And that will have implications for the education profession too. And on that, I'm going to hand back to Pam, who I know wants to come in on some points here.
Thanks, Carol. Just wanting to pick up again on some of these pieces around the longstanding issues of inequities that, you know, Carol has pointed to in terms of the learning loss piece, and thinking to the recent, I mean, it's not recent, it's ongoing, the Black Lives Matter movement, and the pieces that have really come to the fore in the last little while, and certainly that has impacted our thinking and thought process around the original, you know, ways in which we wrote this article. There was a comment in the comment box around the fact that the panel right now is you know, is 3 white women, and we're certainly conscious of that, and we agree that there needs to be examination within education around the ways in which, you know, particularly in the context of our article, the ways in which COVID-19 intersects with race-based data within education, and whether or not in Canada we are collecting that kind of data, and whether or not we're having the information and tools that we need to be able to really understand this in ways that are necessary as we plan school reopening. And so in the context of the work that I do around teacher federations and the labor movement more broadly, I actually attended a webinar yesterday that was hosted by the CLC, and there was presentations from a number of people, including the founder of Black Lives Matter Toronto. And, you know, there are a lot of important pieces here for teacher federations going forward around some of the things that are happening in terms of, again, these intersectionalities with COVID-19. And so I talked about PD training in my original the article originally. And so also thinking about the role of teacher federations in supporting teachers in anti-racist and professional development around those sorts of things, and inequity in education. Also the public advocacy role that teacher federations play. You know, again, human rights issues are issues that teacher federations have in many ways been championing for years, and so this is an opportunity again to partner perhaps with local Black Lives Matter organizations and lobby ministries of education for race-based data on the intersections between COVID-19 and the racialized impact of COVID-19, and how that needs to be considered in the planning going forward for reopening schools. And also the opportunity to elevate the voices of Black and other minority groups within the organizations, and featuring their work, their experiences, and their voices. And we agree that this is something that we all need to do going forward. And so with that, I will pass to Katina for some final thoughts as well, and then we can get to some of your questions.
Thank you, Carol and Pam. I echo your comments. I'm noticing time here, so I'm going to shorten what I was going to report, but piggybacking on what Carol said about implications for workload, staffing, and budget. Myself and Dr. Fay Wong did 2 provincial studies, one in British Columbia and one in Ontario in the fall of 2019, where our preliminary data indicates that principals are experiencing work intensification. We have, since the pandemic, conducted a couple of virtual focus groups, and in these focus groups, our preliminary data is showing signs that the work that's expected of school and school system leaders is quite tremendous. And while the first phase of the COVID pandemic was very much so a crisis phase, not saying that the other phases will not be a crisis phase, I'm hoping that they won't be as severe of a crisis, but that level of work intensification can be ongoing. It will lead to burnout, and it will lead to other well-being issues for those that are leading our school system, and we need to consider that. What we have found in the literature and in the research is that student well-being is first, teacher well-being comes next, and principals and the system often leave principals and their own well-being last, or they don't recognize them at all. So that I just wanted to reiterate that. So, COVID-19 is not a mere bump in the road. The pandemic does not exist in a silo where all else is less important or put on pause. It is unfolding simultaneously with our current climate crisis and alongside social inequities that have always existed. If anything, the COVID-19 pandemic has moved these inequities to the forefront. And some of the inequities that we've talked about today, such as Black Lives Matter, the anti-Black racism, and the truth and reconciliation process. We need to ensure that equitable education exists for all moving forward, and that the divide does not become larger, but becomes narrower. We close the gap. And I know that's kind of cliche jargon words, but if we can move to the next slide, Pam, I think this is a really great closing for our session. In our article, we asked what conditions need to be in place for students to learn, for teachers to teach, and how will leaders across the system adapt to support these conditions? I want to add to those questions, and I want to take from Deborah Nedalicki, 2020. She asks 2 questions. What is it that we've missed that we want to bring back to schooling and education? And what is it that has been removed that we do not want to return? And I think if we use those 2 to help guide us in the decision-making moving forward, it will help us to have those conversations that are greatly needed. So now I'm going to turn it over to questions. So we'll just wait a moment for the questions to be generated in the system. Hi, Benita. We must have either a lot of questions or else the system is not generating them.
So I'll read the questions. Marlene Hood asks, does equitable education implicate international graduate students? I think we have been left alone with the burning cost of the with the burning of the cost and expectations from our own countries and also from our university. Have you included us in any way within your studies?
I'll respond first. Thank you, Marlene. Marlene, my research concentrates on K-12 education, so I cannot speak to that, and my research doesn't cover higher ed. Carol?
Thanks, Katina, and thanks, Marlene, for your question. So yeah, our article focused on K-12 education, which is where our 3 areas of research focus, not on university education, but we are professors at faculties of education. So I certainly understand and your concern and your frustration and the difficulties that international students in particular are experiencing. I certainly know at OISE and at the University of Toronto there is a lot of thought into what the additional supports and needs are. I mean, we didn't discuss this in the article, but of course some of the same things as we've just discussed do apply in terms of university teaching is also going to have to abide by health protocols and physical distancing. And as you will know, we're mainly online at the moment. So we don't have research on this piece, but we certainly have our own professional experience.
Where might teacher education programs fit in this as we try to prepare new teachers to begin their careers in September? And so I'll perhaps lead a little bit on this question. Part of my role at the University of Regina is actually as the Associate Dean of Undergraduate Programming. And certainly the COVID-19 situation and the challenges with K-12 schools being closed and those sorts of things have certainly left us with lots to think through in terms of our planning and how well we actually prepare educators to deal with situations that like that has arisen. I noticed in the comment box earlier about the idea that this is not necessarily regular online learning that's been happening in the places that have been using synchronous and learning, and that has been thrust upon educators. And it's again this challenge back and forth between ensuring that teachers are adequately prepared to teach physically in classrooms, but also looking at online learning spaces and the possibilities that they may bring in certain situations. Of course, there's challenges with that as well. And so we certainly at the University of Regina are thinking about how we might need to rethink some of the ways in which we prepare our educators, and also working alongside of our education sector partners to think about some of that work. And so I guess I would say that like many of the situations that we're facing right now, there are no easy answers. We've developed a number of webinars for our students who are interning in the fall, and we're working on possibilities of internships that also mirror whatever conditions K-12 schools might have at that time. And so there's certainly lots of moving pieces and parts in there, and we certainly do have work to do in that area. Thanks for that question. Do you think that educational necessity requires a 1 meter social distancing rule so that more learners can get back to school?
I'll take that one. I think we have to follow the public health advice. I mean, the scale, I don't want to be dramatic, but the scale of illness and death associated with this virus is one where we absolutely have to have a duty of care to everybody in the education system and more widely in society. So I think we have to follow the public health advice. And then when it comes to the actual teaching and learning piece, we have to follow the educational advice.
Yeah, I would agree. The health authorities are the number one experts in this area. So I think that their recommendations are what school divisions certainly need to follow. And I think that that's that has been certainly the ways in which I've seen most education systems across the country work very closely with the health departments. I know that in Saskatchewan, when they released their thoughts this week about reopening schools in September, the details will be released next week because they're working very closely with the Saskatchewan Health Authority to figure out what that needs to look like. Has there been a lobbying effort to consider all staff well-being, not just frontline, but everyone? And so, Christine, I'm assuming that you are referring to not just the teachers and school leaders and those things, but the the staff and support staff that also work in schools. And so I don't know if Carol or Katina, if you want to handle one of these first.
Thank you. Thank you, Christine. It's a great question. My understanding is that school boards are thinking about staff well-being. And my understanding is staff well-being here is not just the physical distancing so that people don't catch the virus, but also in the well-being around stress connected to COVID-19 pandemic. And the various organizations in Ontario have additional supports for their members. Each board would respond a little differently, and it really would depend on the board itself. For if you're thinking about educational assistance, probably also their union would be providing other kinds of supports. But I do know that particularly thinking about going back to school, this has been a concern effort amongst all. Carol?
I'm happy to give time for more questions.
Jeffrey asks, how can we ensure that assessment practices change to include more formative conversation, observation, and descriptive feedback rather than returning to a focus on summative and traditional grading?
Yeah, I'll start on this one. So thanks, Jeffrey. As you know, this is an area of particular interest of mine. I mean, we knew before COVID that the most powerful forms of assessment are the type that you are describing in your question: assessment for learning, assessment as learning. And of course, now in the context of COVID, I already mentioned that countries have suspended their more traditional types of exams and standardized testing. So whatever happens going forward, the pieces around formative conversations, observation, descriptive feedback that you're asking about are going to be absolutely essential. You know, I can see in the chat box lots of questions about how do we know what learning students have or haven't gained over this period of time. And this is going to be key, and it's going to look at these pieces. So I think there seriously needs to be professional learning, support, a focus on that type of assessment and feedback. There's a lot of people who continue to support summative and traditional grading. That's a larger conversation. In some countries, there is a debate about suspending traditional assessments for next year, given that we do expect there's going to be inequities in people's experiences. So I think that's a much bigger conversation. I think it's an important conversation, and definitely it's a needed conversation.
Mm-hmm. Jane McLeod asks, how might we help school leaders and teachers counter the paternalistic, it's your professional responsibility narrative and prevent expectations of going above and beyond their normal workload during this uncertain time? And I can begin here. Jane, I think that, again, this is a huge role for teacher federations going forward in terms of working together with their members around public campaigns and ensuring open lines of communication with the different groups that might be working through the reopen plans. We know that this is often a moniker that is utilized in education, that, you know, and in some ways teachers themselves, you know, project this idea that, you know, we're here for you, we really want to do, and they do go above and beyond, and we certainly do need to be careful about how that plays out in terms of the workload expectations. You know, teachers cannot be expected to just take all of these things that are being thrust upon them at this time and continue to roll with that within school reopening plans that are requiring all sorts of new tasks and work. And so I think that the collective voice of teachers within you know, as part of their teacher organizations and potentially beyond, the advocacy work here and the public outreach will be exceptionally important in this particular piece. I also think that a lot of parents right now, there is a lot of public support for educators. A lot of parents have come to realize through the pandemic the massive amounts of work that that teachers do, and have gained certainly quite an appreciation for that, having to school and take on that role in some way, shape, or form in their own houses. So I think that, again, this is a really big piece that the teacher organizations, their collective membership, the public advocacy, all plays a role here. Terry asks, given the significant implication of the pandemic on our students and our educators, as you've outlined in the article, both positive and negative, how can we better inform policy and protocols in the coming months as we envision a better world for all in this brave new world?
I guess it's my turn to take a question. Thank you, Terry. Yes, this is a great question. I think all leaders and policymakers and those in education delivering education are struggling with this, because change is so exponentially has grown exponentially. The change has, and the decision making, and also it's now in a virtual world. I mean, that's a question we're going to be working with. What we know is that working from home, having social media platforms, means that there's also a lot of information, misinformation, and fake news shared, where in some situations we have information, policy, and protocols that are shared, and are shared in the traditional methods through email, posting on websites, through reiterated in meetings, and still some people, educators, leaders, parents, don't necessarily get the messaging. And we have to also understand, because that could be because of information fatigue, general anxiety around pandemic, where there's just limited capacity to take in additional information, individuals dealing with their own home life. There seems to be this assumption that, educators somehow go in a closet, and then when school happens, they come out and they don't have their own lives or their own children, or their own health issues, or caring for vulnerable parents or elderly parents. And these are all situations we need to think about when trying to inform better policy and protocols and sharing. I think, though, we need to think about the platforms where we can share central information so that policy can be informed from key stakeholders in a meaningful way, but not just informed, processed, and used to inform protocols. And I don't mean just from the education field. I also mean from other public sectors, because the pandemic is influencing our whole society. And so I think it needs to be larger than just the education system and in the public education. So Carol, Pam, I see we have 1 minute left.
So I would quickly say that, it's very challenging. We have an emergency response situation when people are beginning to find their new routine. New things are happening. We're entering the summer break. There will obviously be potential for summer learning in some provinces and in some forms, and then the rush to get back, whatever back to school means next year. At the same time, we need to find somewhere to pause and to really make sure that the plans going forward are the best plans. It's easy to fall back into old routines, and I think a lot of what we've been seeing is those old routines are not necessarily going to apply in the coming year and maybe beyond. So I think for people have different personal views on how you try to inform policy, how you advocate, but I think for people who want to try and inform policy, work through your professional associations, use your voice as best you can, whether that's through social media, if you feel that's appropriate. You have to be careful about that. Collaborate and connect with other people who are interested. There is growing not only national but international networks of educators trying to come together to share information and to inform those changes. So I would say formally and informally think about how we can attempt to inform policy, because the best policy, as we know, comes from evidence, but it also comes evidence from research and data, but it also comes from professional expertise, experience and judgment. And it's important to listen to students and families and community voices. And the worry I have at the moment is we're in June and there's a lot still to be worked through. But at the same time, COVID moves so quickly, we have to deal with changing situations.
Well, folks, we are at 1 o'clock. We have a number of questions in the feed that we will follow up with. There are some of you that we definitely want to touch base with. We are conscious of the time, and I believe that Ed can was going to come on and also let you know that there's opportunities to have access to the article, the slides, some of the data that we spoke about today, and opportunities to access those things through their website. So thank you very much to all of you who attended today. We have much more work to do in many areas. And we again thank you for your participation and thank you for your questions. And again, we will be following up on some of those questions personally after the session. Thank you very much.